During the Second World War, the United States experienced a revolution in tank design and production. As Hitler's army swept through Europe, America transformed itself from an isolationist backwater to an industrial giant, producing vast numbers of tanks to challenge the Axis forces. Its war-winning weapon was the Sherman. On the 15th of September 1916, the British Army unleashed a secret arsenal of devastating weapons. The German press called them the Devil's Coaches, but back in Britain they were heralded as the key to winning the war. Many soldiers shared this belief and were willing to endure toxic fumes, deafening noise and poor visibility to use this new weapon, the tank. Unlike France and Britain, by 1917 America had not developed its own tanks, nor had it been exposed to tank warfare before it joined the Allies on the Western Front. But US generals did draw one definite conclusion from what they had seen on the battlefields of northern France.
The experience that the Americans brought back from the First World War was that the tank existed to support the infantry. And that's essentially what it was used for in the First War. So all the American thought, doctrine, development goes into an infantry tank. It's taken to such an extreme that in 1920 the Americans abolish the tank corps and they hand over tanks and tank development to the infantry.
Aircraft are coming to the fore at the end of the Great War. Both the US Army and the US Navy are trying to develop air power. And so there's lots of inter-service rivalry, and lots of the limited money that's available goes towards air power rather than towards armour.
So during the 1920s and 30s, tank development was not considered a priority. Some prototypes were developed, but even these were subject to severe constraints.
American tank development really is stagnant until the 1930s. Even then, when they start to think again about tank development, they still can't produce anything which is more than about 15 tons in weight, because that's what American bridging equipment will take.
By the late 1930s, America's tank arsenal consisted of a few hundred light tanks left over from the First World War. Although there was no pressure to kickstart medium tank development, designers did look at the latest technologies.
Right up to the outbreak of the war in September of 1939, American armoured forces are very much focused on light tanks. And in fact, they'd passed up really the J. Walter Christie suspension system, which of course appeared on in the medium tank range.
The Christie suspension was actually a pretty good system. The British used it for one of their tanks and the Dutch used it. The Americans didn't, probably because it was a little bit over-engineered. In some ways it was a bit ahead of its time. Also it was very noisy and squeaky. So the element of secrecy would have been lost if you'd used Christie suspension.
As the US government struggled with the Great Depression during the 1930s, military spending slumped even further. With less money to go round, the US Army favoured light tanks because they were cheaper to produce and because they could replace the cavalry horse.
The two cavalry divisions by the early 1930s had realised that cavalry had probably had its day. Well, they were very reluctant about that, But for them, obviously, that meant that cavalry's primary function of going rapidly behind enemy lines, disrupting enemy communications, that could be best served through a light tank. And that's what, of course, America went for, which was the M2, which could travel at 37 miles per hour, but was very much undergunned and very much under-armoured. So, although, as I say, it was good on blitz, it wasn't very good on Krieg at the end of the day. It's very good on the sort of speed factor.
So by 1939, the US finally had its own tank ready for production, and a mechanised cavalry brigade was created. Amid intelligence of a newly formed German tank division, there was pressure for the brigade to be organised along the same lines. But American generals did not see war as an imminent threat. In the late summer of 1939, Germany stunned the world by invading Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. By the summer of 1940, the Germans had invaded the Low Countries and had completely annihilated the French forces. The British, who fought alongside the French, were forced to abandon their tanks on the beaches at Dunkirk. Nobody could understand how Germany managed to crush its opponents when its tanks were no stronger than those of Britain or France.
The reason the Germans do so much better than the British or the French is not because they've got more tanks, not because they've got better tanks, but because they know how to use them as part of an integrated whole. And that lesson is taken up by the British, passed on to the Americans. The other lesson is that it's no good having a nippy little tank with very little armour and a pea shooter for a gun. You needed a tank with a decent punch, and it needed to have sufficient armour to withstand what the Germans were going to throw at you.
Across the Atlantic, the shockwaves were just starting to be felt. It was clear that if America was to enter the war, it would need a tank that could at least match the German Panzer Mark III. The M2 was not nearly capable of doing this. But after losing nearly all of its tanks at Dunkirk, Britain also needed to re-equip its armoured divisions as soon as possible. America, with its huge steelworks and car factories, was perfectly equipped to produce tanks on a mammoth scale. So funds were made available to design the successor to the M2. But the German army had already started to upgrade the Panzer III. For the Allies, time was running out.
The Panzer III was no better than anything that the British or the French had in 1940. In fact, in many ways, it wasn't as good. Similarly, there weren't a huge number of them. And it was very quickly superseded by the Mark IV, which was a much better tank. But at the same time, the III, that was the first tank that the Germans had really in major numbers, in industrial type production. It enabled them to train, to get accustomed to using armour.
Certainly German tanks were not as heavily armoured, and the 37mm German gun had no advantages whatsoever over the British 2-pounder. In fact, the 2-pounder was slightly superior. So in 1940, the Panzer III didn't seem such a threat, but it rapidly became one because, like the Panzer IV, it was capable of being rapidly upgunned, and this is in fact what started to happen.
I think it was realised by some people that it was the way we were using them that was wrong, as opposed to the tanks themselves. People were very reluctant to accept that. It is always very difficult to say that something you have believed in for years, that you have trained for, you have practiced, is actually not correct. And it took quite a lot of time for people to realise that it wasn't just that German tanks were better, which as the war goes on, they become. They weren't at the beginning of the war. German tactics were better.
By April 1941, a new medium tank was leaving the production line. Named after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, the M3 had a 7-man crew. In addition to its 75mm gun, the M3 also mounted a 37mm gun as well as 4 machine guns. Its armour was up to 37mm thick. Its right radial engine gave it a 340 brake horsepower, a range of 120 miles, and a top road speed of 26 miles per hour. Under the Lend-Lease policy, the UK bought 600 M3 tanks and called them the General Grant. The main selling point of the M3 was a much heavier armament to match the German tanks, which had proved so successful in the battle for France. The main gun was not mounted in the turret, but in a sponson on the right-hand side of the hull. But it could only move 15 degrees up and down.
When the Lee Grant comes in, it's always been the concept that as soon as we have a turret that can take a 75mm gun, that is what we move on to. So in a sense, Lee Grant was always a stopgap.
The Lee Grant played a crucial part in the North African campaign, earning the title Egypt's Last Hope. But it proved unable to deal with the Panzer IV and was eventually replaced by the Sherman. Its wartime career did not end there, though. In 1944, a number of Lees were sent to the mountainous jungles of Burma, where they helped the Allies defeat the Japanese army.
By 42, we desperately needed a proper turret-mounted 75mm gun. 75mm being the smallest size really that could fire a practically useful high-explosive shell.
It had to have a punch. Not only did it have to have a punch, but it had to have a range. One of the problems of all British tanks was that they didn't have the protection that they needed against the equivalent German tanks, and they didn't have a gun that would go through German armour. So all the time our thinking is we need more armour, we need a bigger gun. That isn't as easy as it sounds, because bigger gun, more armour means more weight, therefore means more powerful engine, might mean less manoeuvrability.
What the Allies needed was a tank that could be built in large numbers by a civilian workforce. Not only did it need to be effective in battle, but it needed to be easy to operate and maintain. So designers came up with a medium tank they hoped would fit the bill. The Americans called it the M4, but the British named it the Sherman.
Well, I mean, it really replaces the Grant. It comes along as, you know, the successor to the Grant, as the medium infantry tank for the US Army. And it's going to be the most important tank manufactured in the United States, and one of the most important tanks of World War II.
The M4, or Sherman medium tank, had a 5-man crew. Beside its main 75mm gun in the turret, the Sherman also mounted 3 machine guns, as well as a 50.8mm smoke mortar. Its armour was up to 100mm thick. Its Ford V8 engine meant it was capable of a range of 100 miles, a brake horsepower of 500, and a top road speed of 26 miles per hour.
I think the thing about the Sherman was that it conflates in many ways the idea of a light tank and a medium tank into one tank, and that's one of its great selling features. I think for both the British and ultimately for the Americans.
The Sherman uses quite a lot of the Lee Grant features. It uses the same suspension, initially uses the same engine, uses the same transmission. The big difference is that the Sherman has a cast iron and later a welded hull, which is much safer than having one that's riveted.
The only real differences were the deletion of the escape hatches, which provided a weakness in the armour, which were rapidly recognised. Actually, you wanted, instead of having increasing crew survival by enabling them to get out, probably better if the shell didn't get in the first place.
With orders pouring in, US tank factories were under enormous pressure to produce Shermans quickly, cheaply, and in large numbers. Although the Chrysler plant in Detroit was geared up for mass production, many factories had to be built from scratch. And because the Sherman inherited many features of the Lee Grant, existing assembly lines could be easily adapted without causing a drop in production.
I think the thing about the Sherman tank as well is that it's a reliable tank that can be manufactured relatively easily, in fact very easily, and we can see that by the numbers that are produced. Some historians have put the figures as around about 49, 50,000, but there are figures which claim as many as 58,000 of these tanks were produced. Either way, they produced more Shermans in the United States than the entire German wartime production of tanks.
The Sherman tank entered service with the British 8th Army in Egypt in the autumn of 1942. After months of bitter fighting against Rommel's army, the men were demoralised and exhausted. The British general, Montgomery, faced a bleak situation. He needed to prepare his men to stage a final battle to kick the Axis out of Egypt once and for all. The arrival of 300 Shermans could not have been more timely.
I mean, the Sherman performs very well in the Western Desert. There are already Sherman tanks with the British 8th Army at El Alamein, and they do extremely well. And they're clearly a match for any of the Italian tanks, and also, I would argue, for most of the German armour that's in the theatre as well. So it starts off well with its 75mm gun and a reliable engine and a technically and mechanically a reliable tank.
The Sherman arrives just in time for the Second Battle of Alamein, and in fact there are 300 of them when that battle starts. And they were generally welcomed. Everybody said, whoopee, at last we've got a decent tank. Very quickly, Montgomery is writing to the War Office saying this new miracle tank isn't actually all it's cracked up to be, because it's only just a match for the Mark IV. And given that German tactics at this stage are still a rather better than ours are, the Mark IV versus the Sherman, the Mark IV will generally win.
Well, when the Sherman started to enter service, really the Panzer III, which was one of the principal threats that had been taken into account when it was being designed, was becoming obsolete and was being replaced by the later versions of the Panzer IV with the long-barreled gun. This immediately put the Sherman at a disadvantage because the Sherman only had a short to medium length weapon at the time, didn't have the muzzle velocity.
But as crews got to know the Sherman's strengths, they also discovered its limitations.
I think right from the beginning, it was realised that the high silhouette of the Sherman was a disadvantage. Now, admittedly, at least did have its main armament in the turret on the top, which the Grant, or the Lee Grant, did not. But even so, it was still a very high tank, and that was undoubtedly a disadvantage. How did the crews cope with it? They learnt how to use ground. They learnt how to camouflage. Perforce, they had to.
The high turret was never good. In some respects, in the open desert, you could see a tank anyway. It didn't really matter how high it was. The moment you're moving into more undulating terrain, the Sherman is less able to make use of small undulations than lower tanks are.
The high silhouette of the Sherman is a problem. It's a problem for any tank design, and particularly when you've got very effective German anti-tank defences, and the 88mm is a very effective weapon. This whole profile of the Sherman is a problem for it, and in part it's going to account for the losses that it's going to sustain in combat.
One of the biggest problems was that the Sherman was built to withstand 37mm armour-piercing ammunition. But when the Germans started using their 88mm anti-aircraft gun to knock out tanks, the Sherman's thin armour made it extremely vulnerable to catching fire. This weakness earned the Sherman unfortunate nicknames. The Germans called it the Tommy Cooker, and the Allies called it the Ronson after the lighter because it always lit first time.
The Sherman had one weakness that it was famous for, and this was, as tank crews say, its ability to brew up, that is, catch fire. The battlefields were quite often littered with burning Shermans, quite a distinctive and very distressing sight. What the Sherman's problem was the ammunition stowage. The ammunition was stowed too high up, and what tended to happen is that either a penetrating tank hit, or indeed in some places just a tank hit on the outside of the hull, would transmit shock through it, and it would rupture the cordite propellant, and that would catch fire and cause terrible fires.
Despite these problems, British and American crews had many reasons to be pleased with the Sherman.
The introduction of the three-turret crew on the Sherman, another major factor in its success. It was the key to German success, and once everybody else adopted it, the Russians adopted it on the T-34-85. The whole point of having three crew members was the fact that the loading and firing of the gun were kept separate from the commander. The commander could direct all his attention to focusing the firepower and the manoeuvre of the tank, finding the targets, focusing them, doing the manoeuvre, and that is the key to successful tank warfare.
In December 1941, the United States declared war on the Axis. In what became known as Operation Torch, troops landed in North Africa the following November. But by early 1943, the American army was impatient to take on the Africa Corps, which by this time had been pushed back to Tunisia. By this stage of the long desert campaign, the differences between the hardened British tank crews and their American counterparts really began to show.
That 50 caliber Browning that they have mounted on the top of the American Shermans, which is ostensibly there is an anti-aircraft weapon. The British say, well, that's no use, we don't want that. So they take it off, so they get rid of that.
I think the great difference between American and British tank crews on America's entry into the war after the Operation Torch landings in North Africa in November 1942 is, of course, the British tank crews by this stage are very experienced and they know what the Germans can do. The American tank crews are inexperienced and have no idea what the Germans can do. And it's because of that inexperience that the Americans have this terrible disaster at Kasserine Pass, which is the first major clash between German armour and American armour, and the Americans come out of it very badly.
1,000 men were killed at Kasserine Pass. Hundreds were taken prisoner, and most of their tanks were destroyed. The Americans had relied on the M3 Lee Grant tank during the battle, which proved completely ineffective against the fearsome 88mm anti-tank gun. It was a turning point for the US Army. Commanders were changed, tank strategy was radically transformed, and the Lee Grant was replaced by the Sherman, which went on to become the main Allied tank for the rest of the war. Despite losses on some fronts, the adaptability of the Sherman allowed innovation that saved countless lives. One of the most useful variants to emerge from the desert campaign was the Sherman Crab.
The Sherman Crab was one of a number of armoured engineering vehicles that started to emerge towards the latter part of the Desert War, principally due to the enormous casualties we took in combat engineering during the early part of the war, and the essential need to provide means of overcoming various obstacles.
There were a number of Sherman variants, and one was the Crab, as it was known, the flail tank. This had a roller on the front of the tank with lengths of chain, and it was used for clearing minefields. And you drove it through the minefield, the flail turned, the pieces of chain beat on the ground in front of it and exploded the anti-tank mines. Very, very simple, but very effective way of clearing a lane through a minefield. Very useful in North Africa, where both sides used huge quantities of mines, and equally very useful in Normandy, particularly on the D-Day landings, when we had to be able to clear lanes to get tanks off the beach. So, jolly useful bit of kit.
In 1943, a small Allied force invaded Sicily, and over the following months fought its way up Italy's mountainous spine. The rugged terrain favoured German defenders, and presented huge challenges to Allied tactics.
With the Sherman tank, with its 75mm gun, it could penetrate 3.7 inches of armour plating. The trouble was that both the Panther and the Tiger frontal armour was 4 inches or better. And so in any frontal engagement, the Sherman tank was at a big disadvantage.
The Panther was a terrible surprise for the Americans. They really hadn't counted on encountering anything quite as ferocious as that. And their losses against Panthers in head-on encounters were enormous. At least, the Americans reckoned to lose at least 5 Shermans for every Panther.
The only hope they could have against a Mark V would be to sneak up on it and try and get it from the rear. Perhaps 3 or 4 Shermans might be able to get up behind one Panther. And similarly with the Tiger. If they could get the Tiger with its engine switched off, when the Tiger crew then had difficulty in traversing the gun, they might have a chance. But again, it's a question of using a lot of Shermans to take on one Tiger or one Panther. But we had plenty of Shermans.
The German tank's standard gun was the famous 88mm. It started life as an anti-aircraft gun and was adapted to protect German warships from enemy planes. But the most devastating use for the 88mm was as an anti-tank gun. No other weapon struck fear into the hearts of Allied tank crews in the way the 88 did. No Allied tank could withstand a hit from the 88. This included the Sherman.
This particular German officer was an artillery officer. He was in charge of an 88mm gun in Italy, covering a pass, a little gap in the road that only one tank could come through at a time. And the Americans kept sending a Sherman through each time, and each time the 88 was easily able to destroy it with a single shot. And when asked, well, what happened in the end, he said, well, what happened in the end, we ran out of ammunition and the Americans didn't run out of tanks. And that really shows the utility of being able to mass-produce tanks, but it also shows the awful consequences for American tank crews.
Italy isn't a good country for tanks, certainly once we get into the mountains. So really the tank in Italy is a mobile gun. It's not able to operate widely. It's not able to go for great flanking sweeps because the ground doesn't allow it to. So although we were able to produce far more tanks than the Germans did, our numerical supremacy really was negated by the ground. So it didn't make that much difference.
In response to the difficulties faced by the Allies in Italy, attempts were made to improve the Sherman's performance.
It's become a piece of folklore in many respects that one of the Sherman's great weaknesses was the fact that it was petrol-powered, and great outcries to why the Americans didn't realise this and put a diesel engine in. Well, they did. Over 11,000 Shermans had diesel engines. The US Army then looked into it and decided that because of the type of logistics they would need for Normandy, they couldn't afford to have 2 lots of fuel supply.
Early in 1944, preparations started for an invasion of Normandy. The Italian campaign told the Allies to expect unforgiving terrain and more Tiger and Panther tanks. So America considered producing a heavy tank called the M6. But making this new model would mean changing assembly lines and causing production levels to drop. The Allies were left with little choice but to upgrade the Sherman.
There was real concern in both Britain and the United States, and I think a number of senior people were very worried that in fact America had not gone ahead with the design of the M6 and there was produced a very heavy battle tank of perhaps 50 tons or so that could have competed with the Panther and the Tiger tank. But they're stuck with the medium Sherman. And so the only solution they can come up with really in relation to that is obviously to put an improved gun on the Sherman.
This new up-gunned Sherman was called the Firefly. It had a 5-man crew. Its main armament was the British 17-pounder gun, and it also mounted a machine gun. Its armour was up to 89mm thick. Powered by an A57 multi-bank engine, the Firefly had a range of 100 miles, a brake horsepower of 425, and a top road speed of 25 miles per hour.
Obviously, by 1944, when we get to Normandy, there is a major problem with the Normandy campaign. Normandy is a place, although the beaches are ideal for invasion, once you get off the beaches, the French bocage country clearly favours the defender. You have these earthen banks with stout hedging on the top of them, and the Germans, of course, are able to place mechanised infantry with anti-tank weapons behind those kinds of defensive perimeters, and backed up, of course, by Tiger tanks and Panther tanks. And so Sherman losses began to rise steeply in this attritional warfare.
Despite the difficult terrain, the Firefly performed well, and its bigger gun worked wonders for British morale.
The Firefly was the one Allied tank that had a chance with a Panther and could even take on a Tiger if it was lucky. All the Firefly was a bog-standard Sherman, but instead of the 75mm gun, it had a British 17-pounder gun put in the turret.
The Firefly wasn't a tremendously effective weapon, to such an extent that the Germans told their tank crews always to attack it, which led to the rather interesting experiment, later became very, very standard, of actually painting the end of the barrel pale blue with a brown underneath so that it looked like it was a short barrel. It actually works surprisingly well.
It worked as far as the British were concerned, and they did have one Firefly in each troop of 4 tanks. So you had 3 ordinary Shermans with a 75mm and a Firefly with a 17-pounder. Excellent gun that could take on a German tank. The Americans didn't take that up. They preferred to use their own American 76mm gun, which actually wasn't as good.
The Americans didn't want big guns put in tanks. They wanted possibly big guns put in tank destroyers, but they had their own designs of big gun which they thought would be perfectly adequate. They hadn't factored in the Panther into this at all. Leslie McNair didn't want to put bigger guns in. He was greatly opposed to putting even the American 76mm high-velocity gun into a tank. And it wasn't really until after he got killed in a blue-on-blue accident by the United States Army Air Corps, when he was visiting the front in Normandy, that really this whole logjam got cleared.
In June 1944, Allied troops mounted an invasion of Normandy in northwestern France. Although the Firefly performed well, its armour was too thin to withstand heavy fire from German tanks.
I think, obviously, when we get to 1944 and we get into Normandy, the technical disparities between the German tanks and the M4 Sherman are quite significant in terms of armour as well as in terms of the actual gun that's mounted. And although the Firefly addresses the gunnery issue up to a point, it cannot address the armour protection issue. And so Shermans are still being destroyed in great numbers.
This problem prompted the development of the T-14, otherwise known as the Jumbo. Besides having much thicker armour, it also had extra wide tracks. But the thicker armour made it virtually impossible for mechanics to get to its moving parts. Despite this drawback, 250 were sent to Europe, and they were welcomed by the troops.
The The Sherman Jumbo was a vastly up-armoured Sherman that was specially produced and used in Normandy. It wasn't used extensively as a replacement for the Sherman. The up-armouring had sort of overstressed the suspension and the transmission, and therefore it was only for use in limited numbers in limited situations. But it was very, very popular with the troops. It was essentially used to lead tank formations, but in particular in the bocage, in areas where they might be ambushed, as a lead tank that would be able to take a fair amount of German anti-tank fire and not succumb to it. But it couldn't be used as a main tank because it was really too heavy for the transmission and suspension. I think around 250 were built. There were never enough of them. So what the Americans resorted to doing in Normandy was getting hold of knocked out Panthers and cutting them up and bolting the armour on to the front of Shermans to make these sort of replacement jumbos.
But US generals knew that the war would be won not only on the battlefield, but in America's tank factories. By 1944, the sheer number of Shermans was starting to tip the balance in favour of the Allies. So sacrificing Sherman production in favour of the less reliable T-14 simply wasn't an option.
The thing with the Sherman, we needed so many Shermans that it simply wasn't a matter of introducing a new tank. We could incrementally improve the Sherman, but the Sherman it had to be.
So, with too few jumbos to go around, Sherman crews had to come up with their own creative solutions to improve the safety of their tanks.
They put water jackets round the shells in the upper part of the hull, which stopped them catching fire. If the rack was penetrated, the water would leak onto the fire and put it out. Also, they added what's called applique armour. They welded patches of armour onto the side of the tank. These had a propensity to fall off after one hit, but one hit, saving you from one hit, was quite often quite a good thing anyway. So it had done its job. Certainly, the Americans found after Normandy that of the Shermans without the water jackets on there, the water protection to their magazines, 60 to 80% caught fire when hit, and it went down to about 15% when you fitted the wet protection to the magazines. So that did have a considerable effect on the propensity for the Sherman to explode in flames.
But despite these attempts to improve the Sherman's armour, it was never as protected as the Tiger or Panther, and many of these modifications did little more than improve crew morale. The strength, reliability and maintainability of the Sherman hull and power system meant that it was perfect for conversion to perform engineering tasks. Shermans were rearmed as rocket launchers, flamethrowers, self-propelled artillery and mine layers. For these roles, the tank chassis was adapted to take 105mm howitzers, or up to 20 rockets. The flame guns were either the Canadian Ronson design or more commonly adaptations of the Crocodile system fitted to the British Churchill tank. The wide range of support variants emphasized the versatility of the Sherman hull. Besides the Sherman Crab, some tanks were fitted with Caterpillar bulldozer blades and were used to clear away damaged vehicles from a battlefield or carve a path through obstacles. Others were used to tow damaged vehicles away from the battle zone for repair. The bridge carrier was an important conversion. This involved clamping a mobile assault bridge to the Sherman hull using an A-frame. The carrier would then be lowered into place over the stream or gully and released.
The Sherman variants, I think obviously people are aware of often the flail tanks of the Scorpion and of the Crab. But there were two other variants. There was a beach armoured recovery vehicle variant. And this was a type of Sherman that was designed actually to go out into 10 feet of water and recover so-called drowned vehicles, vehicles that had, for some reason or other, ended up in the drink, as it were. And so it was designed to actually tow them off and retrieve them, and also actually free up beached landing craft and that kind of thing. So it performed a valuable function in that kind of capacity.
One of the most famous Sherman amphibious conversions was the duplex drive, otherwise known as the DD. The DD was the name given to Sherman's encased in disposable buoyancy tanks. The duplex drive itself was a mechanism that enabled the tank to be driven by conventional tracks and, at the flick of a switch, by marine propellers. The development of the DD was prompted after a disastrous amphibious landing at Dieppe in 1942. It emerged in time for the D-Day invasion.
One of the lessons from the Dieppe raid was that you needed to be able to get armour onto the beach at the same time as the infantry. Now, how did you do that? Well, there were two ways of doing it. You could either put 13, 14 tanks in a landing craft tank, drive it up to the beach and debouch your tanks. Difficulty, the landing ship tank was a huge target, and if it was hit coming in, then you lost all the tanks that were on it. Or you could swim in tanks individually, except the tanks can't swim. They're about as good in the water as a brick.
The Normandy invasion saw the first trial of the revolutionary amphibious tank, the DD, or duplex drive.
Quite a frightening concept in many ways. It was developed by the people who make lilos, who invented the lilo, and it comprised of a screen that was raised upon folding a frame. And what it actually did, it was just increase the displacement, the water displacement of the tank, so that it would actually float. The tank was waterproofed, but all that this canvas screen did was increase it, and the tank sort of floated along rather precariously.
You have this DD drive, a so-called duplex drive, because on land the tank is still powered in its normal way with its traction, but in water it's powered by two propellers, which actually could make it travel at 6 miles per hour, providing the water was relatively calm. This is not a sort of seagoing vessel that you would want to be in any type of rough weather, which is why they lost so many of them in the actual invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, because the channel was still very rough.
They were only supposed to be dropped fairly close to the beach, but there was a navigation error. The Americans dropped theirs a long way out. Also, they dropped them at the wrong place along the beach, and the tanks had to turn relative to the tide and the waves to try and reach the beach, and they got swamped doing the turn. If they'd been dropped closer in, they would have worked quite well. They worked quite well further down the beach.
The water simply came across. In some cases, we're talking about a freeboard of only a few inches. So, any kind of sea at all is going to cause a problem here. However, that was offset by the fact that the surprise of the defender suddenly seeing a tank coming ashore, swimming ashore from sea. The actual skirt, was very easy to drop down, and so the tank was almost instantly ready for action. And it certainly had a big psychological impact upon the enemy, seeing something like that being used against them.
But many crews perished. They were equipped with submarine escape gear, but how many of them actually managed to use it? Very few in number.
The Sherman earned its place as the main battle tank of the Second World War. Although not a match for the largest German tanks, its reliability and speed earned it respect among tank crews. Its strong, adaptable hull made it perfect for conversion, but most importantly, its simple design meant that it could be assembled in huge numbers by a civilian workforce who, until 1940, didn't know what a tank was. In the end, the German army just could not fight against the tidal wave of Shermans. It truly was the Allied workhorse that helped win the war.
This was an exceptionally good, reliable, versatile, medium tank that really did far more than one could have expected of one tank design. It really was an exceptional tank in terms of the fact that it served throughout really the bulk of World War II and performed in so many different and diverse tasks, from really El Alamein in the Western Desert, through the Italian campaign, through the invasion of France, and ultimately into the actual seizure and conquest of Germany. So in terms of this as a medium tank, it's clearly one of World War II's finest tanks.
It was incredibly reliable, it was capable of being upgunned, it was capable of being up-armoured, and in many respects, it was the sheer fact that it was available in such numbers. It was such a producible design.
The Sherman was never a terribly good battle tank. It was really only about on a par with the German Mark IV, and that had been superseded twice in the German army. Nevertheless, it was reliable, it was relatively easy to maintain, and because it was produced by industry in 11 different plants, including one in Canada, and using assembly line procedures, it could be produced by the thousand. In fact, 55,000 roughly of Shermans were built during the war. Yes, it had disadvantages. Its gun wasn't anything like big enough. It wasn't well enough protected. It had a distressing habit to blow up. But because there were so many of them, we win, not because it's a better tank, but because we've got far more of them.
One Panther might be equivalent to 5 Shermans, but you're far more likely to have 5 Shermans on the day than you ever were to have one Panther.
The KV tank symbolized the iron will of communist Russia to outproduce, out-armor, and outgun the capitalist West during the Second World War. It proved its worth in the war against Finland, and by 1941, it was the most powerful tank in the world. The KV's robust design even forced German designers to come up with a tank strong enough to take it on. By 1945, it had evolved from a brutal fighting machine to a war-winning weapon. In the first half of the 20th century, Russia transformed from a rural backwater into an industrial colossus, which by 1941 had produced the world's most indestructible tank. By the end of the Second World War, it had produced more tanks than Germany and the United States put together. But Russia was a relative latecomer to tank design and production.
The Russians had no experience of tank warfare in the First World War. The Eastern Front, wide open spaces, massed cavalry was effective on the Eastern Front, which it never could be on the Western Front. So there was really no push towards mechanization on the Eastern Front. First time the Russians come up against tanks in any number is during the Russian Civil War, 1919 onwards, when the Bolsheviks, who've seized power in 1917, are fighting the White Russians, a mixture of Mensheviks and monarchists. Now the British, the French and the Americans are supporting the White Russians, and they supply them with a number of tanks. The Bolsheviks capture some of them and use them. Now tanks were not crucial in the Russian Civil War. They really had very little effect. Armoured cars and armoured trains were far more important than tanks, but the idea was sown.
But there's clearly a division here between Russian military professionals and those informed by Marxist-Leninist ideology. And many of those informed by Marxist-Leninist ideology who had served with the 1st Cavalry Army, who were loyal to Stalin in his struggle with Trotsky, people like Budeny and Voroshilov, are people who are very much wedded to the idea still of cavalry and mass infantry assault, rather than use and application of armour.
During the 1920s, Russia's military thinkers set about studying tactical maneuvers in great depth. By analysing various military engagements, such as the Great War, they planned to outline how a war might be waged in the future. Their thinking led to the development of a theory which eventually became known as deep battle.
The Russians accepted that whatever form future war might take, it would involve wide open spaces. The deep battle concept, which was the Russian idea of what future war might be, was not dissimilar to Little Hart's idea of the expanding torrent in England, or the German version, which was blitzkrieg. Essentially, they are all the same. What the Russians thought was that you would need a tank of some sort, probably a heavy tank, to support the infantry and create breaches in the enemy defences, and then you would need a medium tank or a light tank to exploit those breaches. What you would do is you would break through enemy defences, you would drive deep into enemy territory, and then you would carve up your enemy.
So it's a very offensive concept. It's a way of breaking down the trench lines of the First World War. The Russians like it because they want to fight an offensive war and because they believe in independent mobile operations of the kind that cavalry used in the Civil War, and because they are very keen on motor cars and vehicles of all kinds. So these things all come together. And so in the early 1930s, Tukhachevsky, who's the head of materiel for the Red Army, becomes the main advocate of the deep battle concept. And it's really adopted in 1932-33 as the main doctrine of the Red Army.
The Soviets knew that in order to defeat a capitalist coalition, they would need to modernize and equip their army with weapons and armor far superior to those of their enemy. But Russia lacked the industry to equip a 20th century army. Stalin soon found a radical solution to this problem. In 1928, Stalin introduced a drastic program to kickstart production. It was industrialization at a speed never witnessed nor attempted before.
Russia was defeated in the 1914 to 1918 war because it was backward. It was defeated in lots of other wars because it was backward and trying to catch up with other states. And Stalin's whole idea in the 30s is that Russia won't be backward anymore and it will have modern armed forces. He's not alone in that because Russian governments, really from the time of Peter the Great, have been trying to catch up with the West and carry forward state-sponsored modernization for military goals.
Stalin planned to use his position as leader to impose a harsh program of industrialization. This would mean taking money away from his people and injecting it into his meager army, so improving military output. Called the 5-year plan, this project would allow Russia the opportunity to modernize its army and eventually surpass the capitalist West. As the 1930s beckoned, Russia stood on the brink of an industrial campaign of modernization, the likes of which the world had never seen before. Whilst effectively starving his own people, Stalin poured money into the development and production of military hardware.
In 1927 to 1932, Stalin carries out the first 5-year plan. And this first 5-year plan is about industrialization, it's about steel mills, it's about importing technology, it's about building tractors, it's about building cars and other kinds of vehicles, it's about building aircraft. It's also very much geared towards national defense. And when Stalin is trying to sell the idea of industrialization and to sell the idea of the fast pace of industrialization, he justifies it on the grounds of economic modernization of the military.
Stalin has this very, very strong view of socialism in one country, the idea that capitalist countries are out to destroy the Soviet Union and this alternative Marxist-Leninist vision. And so that's clearly something that informs the ideologues and Stalin himself in terms of how he reacts in relation to Western powers. There's no question about that. And I think armour plays a part in all of this, and it's certainly something which concerns the Soviet Union in terms of making sure that it has got a large armoured force.
In 1931, an enormous tank-building program was launched. Over the years that followed, a number of heavy tanks were produced as Soviet designers experimented with different features. The main heavy tank that emerged from Russia during the 1930s was the T-26. A number were sent to Spain to help the Republican cause. It was a baptism of fire, and the experience marked a turning point for Russian tank evolution.
The Spanish Civil War had a large impact on Soviet armoured vehicle development. It was here that they came up against the Germans for the first time. Their tanks were exposed to high-velocity anti-tank fire, first of all from the small 37mm anti-tank gun, but increasingly towards the end of the conflict, the Germans, the Condor Legion, started using the 88mm gun as an anti-tank weapon. As a result of this, the Russians soon realised that they would have to dramatically up-armour and up-arm their vehicles. And this started a race which they took far more seriously, in fact, than the Germans did.
So as a result of the experience of being in Spain, tactically, the Russians learn important lessons. They have better armored tanks, and they go for the diesel engine as a more reliable power source. So you have a kind of paradox. On the one hand, the kind of operational lesson is the wrong one, that you can't use tanks independently. But technically, they do produce better tanks as a result of what they learned in Spain.
But while Russian tanks were being put through their paces in Spain, Stalin embarked on an 18-month campaign of terror that later became known as the Purges. The stronger the Red Army grew, the more Stalin suspected it of harboring Tsarist sympathizers who were plotting to overthrow him. So Stalin drafted a list of supposed enemies and had them killed or sent to concentration camps. The effect on the Red Army was devastating.
3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union are made to disappear. And of the corps commanders, these are lieutenant generals and generals, 75 out of 85 of those senior officers are eliminated in really effectively 12 to 18 months. At a divisional level, over half of the divisional commanders are also essentially killed or in some cases placed in gulags. Some of those officers actually are going to be resurrected, of course, once the war with Germany begins, and they are actually going to reappear again in 1941 and 1942, but not before, as I say, over half of the divisional officers are killed, 75 out of 85 of the corps commanders, and 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union.
Those that are left, from all levels, from general down to second lieutenant, are very careful about taking a decision themselves. They're very careful about using their initiative. They're very, very careful about doing anything that might draw the unfavourable attention of the Commissar and the party upon them. So, in a sense, it stultifies the Russian army. It brings their professional standards way down, and they suffered for it in 1941.
Stalin's paranoia and subsequent purges had caused great damage to the structure of his army and power base. As a result, he was left with a massive armed force, but little military intelligence or confidence to back it up. By the end of the 1930s, Russian designers were experimenting with a number of heavy tank designs. The experience of Soviet tanks in the Spanish Civil War had clearly demonstrated the weakness of their armour against German 37mm anti-tank guns. So in 1937, the Directorate of Armed Forces issued a new specification. Further heavy tanks would have to be sufficiently armoured to withstand fire from a 76.2mm gun and be powered by a diesel engine. Several models were produced, one of which was the KV. The KV was named after Klimenty Voroshilov, the Soviet People's Commissar for Defense. It had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 76.2mm gun with 3 7.62mm machine guns. Its armour was up to 106mm thick. The KV was powered by a V2 diesel engine capable of 500 brake horsepower, a range of 225 kilometres and a top road speed of 35 kilometres per hour.
The tank was 46 tons, quite heavy, and one of the drawbacks already was at the time that it couldn't keep up with the T-34s, and that was a setback to it. It had, however, quite a few advanced things incorporated, like the torsion bar suspension, and also had a compressed air starter. But in general, it was a bit long for its design, and the steering was rather primitive and gave often trouble. That was its weakest link, really, the steering system.
Despite its low speed, the KV-1 used its workhorse V2 diesel engine to great effect.
The V2 was an excellent engine. It was simple, it was easy to maintain, and it had the great benefit of being diesel, which meant that it was much easier to start in the cold Russian winters. Less problems with ignition, less problems with damp. But when you think about it, that engine didn't really change very much. Right up until the late 60s, the Russians were still using essentially that same engine on all their tanks.
By the late 1930s, Stalin had become increasingly worried that Russia would be invaded from the West. This fear was intensified by the fact that Leningrad, with its population of 3.5 million, was just 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. Stalin approached the Finnish government with requests, including one to build a naval base, all of which were refused. So in November 1939, he ordered the invasion of Finland. On paper, the Red Army had an enormous advantage, outnumbering the small Finnish force by more than 5 to 1. It was backed up by over 1,500 tanks, a number of which were KVs. Yet the campaign turned into a complete disaster for Russia.
The war in Finland is a rather strange war because it isn't really suited for the kind of independent operations which Deep Battle takes into account. It's much more like the First World War than anything that will come later on. And in particular, there's a problem of getting through the Mannerheim line, which is the line of Finnish field fortifications between Leningrad and Finland. It's very hard to break through those lines. They've got mines, they've got anti-tank guns, they've got concrete pillboxes, and so on. And so, in a way, the KV is suited for that more than it is suited for operations in the open steppes of Ukraine or even in Belarusia, because it's a relatively slow tank, but a very heavily armored one.
In order to successfully overrun the Finnish fortifications, the Soviets knew their attack would need to be well concentrated and executed perfectly. However, the effect of Stalin's purges on the Red Army was also starting to show. Men were poorly trained, and most of their tanks were not equipped to deal with the anti-tank guns and minefields of the Mannerheim line. That is, except for one.
Now, the KV tank is going to be one of the few success stories in relation to this war against Finland, in the sense that it is very, very effective against destroying Finnish entrenched positions and Finnish bunkers, and does have a significant impact upon the battle. But it's literally about the only Soviet success story in relation to this conflict, and in fact the Russians lose extensively in this conflict. They lose hundreds of tanks, literally hundreds of tanks. Their air power is ineffective because, of course, much of this fighting is north of the Arctic Circle, and of course so much of the time it's dark because it's north of the Arctic Circle, and so therefore air power can't be deployed. And the Finns, using ski troops, are extremely mobile, very, very effective and well led under Mannerheim, and put up a very, very good fight, really.
Despite the Finns' fierce resistance, the Red Army broke through the Mannerheim line in February 1940. Although the KV had contributed to this success, its performance in battle had also highlighted a number of faults. Besides needing another crew member to take the pressure off the commander, the KV needed a larger gun that could blast open bunkers. But mounting a bigger gun meant enlarging the turret, so the KV-1 was adapted. The resulting tank was called the KV-2, but was named Dreadnought by its crews.
Leading on from the KV-1, we have the development of a new high silhouette tank called the KV-2. Now, this was to be a real attempt at mounting a large gun on a tank chassis. And initially they start with a 122mm, but that quickly is upgraded to a 155mm gun, which they mount on the KV-2. Now, mounting this kind of gun on the same chassis as a KV-1 obviously meant that the actual tank, the whole balance of the tank, the whole centre of gravity of the tank, and the actual weight of the tank were all dramatically altered.
The addition of a larger gun totally changed the shape of the KV. It could accommodate a 6-man crew. Its main gun was increased to a 152mm howitzer, alongside which were mounted two 7.62mm machine guns. It shared its predecessor's V2 diesel engine and 600 brake horsepower. The KV-2 had a range of 200 kilometers and could hit a top road speed of 26 kilometers per hour. The KV's real baptism of fire came in 1941. Despite signing a non-aggression pact, Hitler did not trust Stalin and decided to launch a preemptive strike. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, Hitler launched his most ambitious attack of the Second World War. To defeat the Red Army, Germany sent a force of over 3 million men, backed up by hundreds of thousands of armoured vehicles, horses and aircraft. Their aims were to capture Leningrad, Moscow and Kiev. The main German battle tanks were the Panzer Marks III and IV. But despite this show of strength, Hitler did not expect a struggle. His panzers had demolished every Allied tank in their path, and he believed that Russia, an inferior nation, was simply unable to produce anything to match German technology. As it awaited the arrival of the German force, the Red Army deployed the KV and its main medium tank, the T-34. When German troops met both tanks, their shock was palpable.
When the Germans initially met the KV, there was consternation, in some cases panic even. The Germans find here's this huge tank rumbling along, or perhaps not even rumbling along, perhaps just staying still at a crossroads. And however much they fire at it, they can't do it. It has absolutely no effect. Everything bounces off. There are instances of a KV driving rather slowly through the serried ranks of German tanks, and nobody can do anything about it. And the only way they can take it out is by about turning, driving alongside it, and getting it up the rear. So it certainly worries them initially.
So what message they get, the Germans, in June, July 1941, is not that the Russians have a very mobile tank or a very good all-purpose tank, which is the T-34. What they learn is that the Russians have a very heavily armored tank, which is the KV, and that tank cannot be the armor can't be penetrated by the 37mm anti-tank gun, or by the 50mm anti-tank gun, or by any tank gun carried by German tanks of the time.
The Germans quickly realized there were few ways to successfully attack and destroy a KV tank. One way was simply to outnumber it, overpower it with firepower from all sides. The other, more reliable method was to use an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. But even then, artillery troops would need to erect and aim the gun first, an extremely time-consuming maneuver during the heat of battle. So the KV prompted the German army to step back, to realize the limitations of their own tanks, and to create something to match it. By 1942, Hitler's army had pushed well into Russia, seizing towns, villages and cities. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners had been captured and countless numbers had died in combat, but the battle raged on. Hitler thought that the defeat of the Red Army was possible, but dependent on a steady, relentless onward march. He knew his army did not have time to get bogged down in battle, and that to fail in the north of Russia would also mean failure in the south. But the sheer robustness of the Russian KV tank had become a painful thorn in the Führer's side. German troops reported again and again of how the KV tank had prevented their advance and of their frustrating inability to effectively destroy it. But perhaps the Germans should have recognized the Russian threat earlier. Back in the late 1930s, the two powers had sustained an uneasy partnership. After expressing their mutual desire to control Poland, they had worked together closely to discuss the possibility of eventually dividing it up between them. Both countries had been privy to one another's affairs, as well as to one another's military capabilities.
It is said that during that very artificial German-Soviet alliance, cobbled together by Ribbentrop to allow them to divide Poland between them, that a Russian armoured delegation visited German tank factories and were shown the Mark IV. And they said to the Germans, yes, don't you have anything bigger than that? The Germans said no, because they hadn't. And the Russians believed that something was being hidden from them. The Germans surely must have something bigger than the Mark IV. The Russians, of course, knowing that they had the KV and the T-34 under development, both of which were considerably bigger, or would be, than the Mark IV.
The KV was not only shell-proof, but it could overcome virtually any obstacle. Once the Germans discovered the KV's power, their consternation turned into outright panic. Hitler's plan to secure Moscow before the onset of winter was fading fast, and as more and more KVs got in their way, the progress of the German army became unbearably slow. The bitterly cold weather soon kicked in. The German army was not prepared for a winter war. Panzers continually broke down as they could not deal with the mud and snow, and their dependence on petrol meant that their engines wouldn't start in the plunging temperatures. There was no antifreeze, their weapons wouldn't work, and there were not even enough supplies to clothe and feed German soldiers. These problems delayed the march on Moscow and allowed the Soviets enough time to call up reinforcements to defend the capital. However, the situation remained precarious for the Red Army. As new tank divisions were employed to defend the front line, Soviet commanders became increasingly aware that their tank crews were extremely inefficient and unable to control their own vehicles effectively. Thanks to Stalin's infamous purges years earlier, there was no longer a coherent training regime or anyone with enough knowledge and experience to train new recruits.
Having built up this tremendous doctrine, the whole operational art concept, the ability to carry it out, the necessary training, the training base of trained officers was wiped out. So it was in many respects all for nothing, and all that was left really was the tanks.
At a sort of NCO level and at a sort of level of, a basic level if you like, the training was no more than in some cases an hour on tanks. And so you were expected to be able to drive a KV tank or a T-34 tank perhaps after 1 hour's instruction. And so this clearly was not very effective. You'd been drafted in from the infantry or the cavalry on that basis. In terms of the junior grade officers, in terms of the second lieutenants and lieutenants, many of them also had no real training in the operation of tanks in terms of how tanks should operate on the battlefield, either individually or collectively. And so in terms of crew training, there is a real problem in terms of Soviet armour, really right up until the end of 1942.
Despite the inefficiency of Soviet tank crews, Moscow had been saved from occupation, at least for the time being. But north of Moscow, another calamity beckoned. By the end of 1941, Leningrad had become encircled by German forces. Its imminent invasion caused anxiety amongst the Russian hierarchy, not only from a territorial standpoint, but also because Leningrad was home to KV tank production. For Stalin, it was time to think the unthinkable.
In a way, the most dangerous moment for the Russians comes in the autumn and winter of 1941 and early 42, when the tank plants are being moved back into Siberia and into the Urals. And it's not really until the spring of 42 that production picks up again. So how do the Russians survive when they can't actually build tanks for about 6 to 9 months?
Russia remained defiant in the face of German adversity. Although he would have to do without a steady stream of new KV tanks, Stalin knew that at some point his factories would still have to produce a surplus to help sustain tank numbers during the break. On top of all this, by mid-1942, the tank's design faults were really beginning to surface.
The KV2, although an awesome sight on the battlefield, was limited in several critical ways. For example, the ball bearings that operated on the turrets actually were not effective at dealing with this kind of gun and the weight of this gun. And in fact, the gun, although it could traverse 360 degrees, it could only do that when the tank was stationary and when it was also on flat terrain. And so basically, although it is a very impressive weapon, it does have serious limitations. It does have this very, very powerful gun, but it's a gun which cannot be used effectively on the battlefield. You have to stop to actually fire the weapon.
It's amazing how the Russians, whom we praised up all the while now with the T-34, got the idea of putting out the KV2, which of course was the chassis of the KV1 and had a big steel box on top, like a rabbit's hatch, with a hefty 15.2mm gun in there. Again, for bunker busting things meant, I suppose. But even the Russians got fed up with it because there was no way of camouflaging it in any position. You see, it was so big and cumbersome, they just didn't like it anymore. You couldn't miss it, you see, even if you shot at it. It must belong to the sort of school in the Russian army hierarchy that everything big must be good, you see.
After narrowly failing to conquer Russia in 1941, Hitler had to reassess his options. He could not afford to mount another attack on nearly the same scale, but he was not willing to remain on the defensive and consolidate his gains. As 1942 wore on, the Red Army began to hit back with a vengeance, inflicting huge defeats on the Germans at Stalingrad and at the gates of the Caucasus. These defeats severely dented the German army's belief in its own invincibility. But the German army was far from beaten. A brutal counterattack in the summer of 1942 was enough to remind Stalin that the war was not lost. Worse still, it marked a turning point for the KV.
The real swan song of the KV is the Battle of Kharkov in the summer of 1942, and they used KVs in quite large quantities, and it's a Russian disaster. And really from that time, I think the Russians realized that the KV is too awkward to be used effectively as a battle tank. One of the problems with the KV is it's quite slow. It's also a very heavy tank. So, you know, it may seem like an obvious problem, but you can't get through a bridge with a 45-ton tank. You'll destroy the bridge as you go over it. And it's very hard to operate T-34s and KVs together because the KV is slower and it destroys the bridges. So in the end, what the Russians go for is all T-34 formations without very many KVs.
There was one other source of hope for the German army. It finally had an answer to the KV.
In 1941, the Germans are astonished by how good the Russian tanks are. And the KV, the T-34 are mechanically much better than any German tank. They're not operated as well, but in terms of their gun and their armor, their mobility, they are better than the German tanks. Between June of 41 and the summer of 43, the Germans make every attempt to match the Russians in terms of quality, if not of quantity. So they're trying to have tanks that are as good as the KV. So they build the Tiger to really have the same kind of armor as the KV, and with a gun that can penetrate the armor of either the T-34 or the KV. It's an 88mm high-velocity gun. It's ideal for knocking out other tanks.
The Tiger tank was more than a fitting match for the Russian KV. But at Kursk, the Axis forces discovered they could not compete with the sheer number of Russian tanks on the battlefield. The original plan had been straightforward enough. By July 1943, Hitler had recognized that a large Soviet salient had formed around the city of Kursk. This salient was creating a bulge in the German front, nearly 200 kilometers wide and over 75 kilometers long. The bulk of the Red Army was stationed in this bulge. For Hitler, it was too good an opportunity to miss. He ordered his army to crush the salient and to put all Tigers into battle. This was, however, against the advice of his generals, who had argued that there were not nearly enough Tiger tanks to ensure decisive success. Nevertheless, in what became one of the biggest set-piece battles in history, and the largest tank engagement of the war, Soviet tank crews came face to face with the Tiger. Hitler took a big gamble at Kursk and lost heavily. It extinguished any hopes he had of securing victory in the east. But this loss could not be entirely blamed on the ratio of tank numbers in the field. The Soviet Army's triumph at Kursk had also been the result of a quiet revolution that had been taking place within the Red Army. By mid-1943, it was a different Soviet force to the one that struggled against the German tidal wave in 1941. Stalin had been compelled to reorganize his troops following the humiliating performance of his army in 1941. He had replaced his circle of sycophants with honest generals, and the role of the commissar had been downgraded so that soldiers would start to use their own initiative again. Nepotism had, at last, been replaced by a meritocracy. The Red Army's motorized divisions had also been reorganized along German lines, with the T-34 leading the way as the Soviet tank of choice.
As time goes on, the KV becomes less and less relevant. It becomes less and less relevant for two reasons. First of all, once the tide of the war on the Eastern Front shifts and the Russians are no longer on the defensive, then for offensive work, the KV is not the ideal tank. Nevertheless, they keep producing them because the assembly lines are there. It is still useful. They do upgrade it as time goes on. They up-armor it. It's the same tank, but they improve it. Eventually, of course, they get to the point where there's been so much extra armor put on it that it can no longer work with the T-34. So it is then put into separate units. But the Russians are still thinking in terms of heavy tank. Eventually, the Joseph Stalin heavy tank comes on stream. That then becomes the latest, the modern Russian heavy tank. But essentially, it's a KV. It's just a better KV, better armor, better transmission, better gun, better turret. But it's a spin-off from the KV.
The changing tide of the war and the threat of the Tiger tank spurred Soviet designers to come up with an upgraded version of the KV. And in 1944, it emerged. It was called the IS, after Stalin himself, and it evolved steadily to become the tank that finally liberated Russia.
First of all, there was the KV-85, which put in the new 85mm gun in a modified turret. That was an incremental step that was needed to address particular shortcomings. However, a redesign was also undertaken, and basically the automotive parts of the KV design and the chassis became the basis for the IS-1 and the IS-2 tanks.
Development of the IS tank series had only started in 1942. But due to the impressive performance of the Tiger tanks during the Kursk battle, Soviet officials decided to push their new tank into general production much earlier than initially planned. Just 1 year later, the first IS tanks were rolling off the production line. Various versions of the tank were tried and tested until eventually the IS-2 emerged. By 1944, the IS-2 was in general production and had become a staple ingredient in the Red Army's arsenal. It worked well to symbolize Russia's evolution in the tank development process and served as a fitting statement of strength against the dying Nazi dream. Well-armored, mounting an enormous gun, it was extremely reliable and spearheaded the victorious Soviet push towards Berlin. The IS-2 was one of the most powerful tanks to emerge during the Second World War. It had a 4-man crew. The IS-2's enlarged turret housed a 122mm gun, the largest gun ever to be mounted on a tank during World War II. Its armor was up to 160mm thick. Using the tried and tested V2 engine, the IS-2 had a range of 150 kilometers, and it could hit a top speed of 37 kilometers per hour. At the end of 1943, Allied leaders Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt met up in the Middle East to discuss plans to launch a major offensive against Germany in the coming year. It was decided that Churchill and Roosevelt would lead an Allied offensive from the western coast of Europe. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the aim of the attack would be to force the Axis army eastwards, back into the very heartland of Germany. Similarly, Stalin promised to launch his own offensive to coincide with the Allied invasion. Operation Bagration, as it was known, was eventually launched on the 22nd of June 1944, the third anniversary of Hitler's invasion of Russia. The armed force consisted of 1,700,000 Soviet troops, supported by 6,000 aircraft, 24,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 tanks. The attack destroyed Army Group Center, releasing Moscow from the Axis grip, and became the most disastrous defeat suffered by Germany in the entire war. It cost the Wehrmacht more men and material than their notorious rout at Stalingrad, and it was the IS tank that helped inflict this punishing defeat.
Operation Bagration begins in June of 1944. Now, this operation was meant to coincide with the Normandy landings on 6th of June 1944. In reality, the ever-cautious Stalin held those operations back for a couple of weeks just to see how the Allies were going to get on in Normandy before he actually committed his forces. But towards the end of June, they do launch this massive series of offensives, in fact 9 separate offensives, with the massive use of armour, Russian heavy tanks, with great dramatic effect. And Bagration actually is going to have a huge success in the late summer and autumn of 1944, effectively liberating most of the Soviet Union and really driving the whole of the German army back to Eastern European boundaries.
History tells us how the German forces were eventually defeated by the Allies, and how Russia chased its fleeing enemy all the way back to Berlin, where the Third Reich was destroyed in May 1945. Following Hitler's death and the subsequent dissection of the German capital, the career of the IS tank continued to flourish. In an ironic twist, the very same tank that had helped the Russians to defeat Nazi Germany became the machine that would threaten the capitalist West during the Cold War. Although it eventually became known as the T-10, the tank remained in service for Russia until the late 1960s. The KV was one of Russia's longest-serving tanks of the Second World War. When it was designed in 1939, the KV was the most advanced heavy tank in the world. It emerged as a valuable battle tank during the notorious Finland campaign and proved its worth when it halted the German advance at the gates of Moscow. But by mid-1943 it had become a liability, and its German rival was starting to pose a real threat to the Red Army. Undeterred, Soviet designers saw an opportunity to transform the KV into the tank that would ultimately push Hitler's army back to Berlin.
The KV-1 could go through anything, and it terrified and demoralised the Germans. The only problem was the KVs weren't available in large enough numbers. They were difficult to deploy, they were difficult to get across bridges and things like this because they were so big and heavy.
Although the engine is excellent, there are huge problems with the transmission. To change gear, you had to stop the tank. So although it was quite fast, you very rarely actually achieved its highest speed.
The KV suffered because it was compared with really a first-rate tank in the form of the T-34. The KV wasn't as fast, it was more awkward, it didn't have a better gun, it didn't have a better motor, it wasn't any easier to use tactically. But it was still, by the standards of the time, much better than any comparable German or British tank in 1941.
The T-34 medium tank was one of the technological wonders of the Second World War. Designed, built and used in Russia, the T-34 stunned the invading German army and prevented it from seizing Moscow. The Third Reich even tried to clone the T-34, but its attempts never challenged the supremacy of the Soviet Colossus. Yet the story of the T-34 is a truly remarkable one. Unlike its Western counterparts, the T-34 did not emerge from a long tradition of tank development. It was the result of overnight industrialization at tremendous human cost. The T-34 was Stalin's way of showing the world that Russia could outgun, outproduce, and overwhelm the industrial West.
It was a very, very good tank. When the Germans met it, they were amazed.
The T-34 symbolized the Russian fight for industrial supremacy with the capitalist West. Not only was the T-34 the best all-round tank by 1941, but it retained this dominance until the end of the war. But the T-34 was also the product of a strong military. By 1945, the Red Army was the most effective force in the world at conducting large-scale armoured operations. Yet the T-34 and the Red Army could not have emerged from more unlikely beginnings.
The First World War had been fought in a very, very backward way, and in fact Russia lost that war partly because it was so backward. The Civil War, which was fought between 1917 and 1920, was even more backward than the First World War was. It was largely a war fought by cavalry. But it did establish in Russia a tradition of using cavalry for independent operations, what might be called later on deep operations.
The Revolution and Civil War convinced the Bolsheviks that they would need a military arm to stay in power. So in 1918, the Red Army was born.
The Russian Civil War is critical in understanding the creation of the modern Red Army. Obviously, with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, there was then, following on from that, the Russian Civil War, which took place between 1919 and really 1921. And Russia really was facing forces both from Japan and also from America and Britain, and also internal opposition from the so-called white forces. Now, the Russian Bolshevik forces did not perform particularly well, and under pressure in relation to this, Leon Trotsky, who was the sort of father of the modern Russian army, brought back 48,000 Tsarist officers, and also senior NCOs were also brought back to try and resurrect the professionalism of the Russian army. So in that sense, the Civil War is very important in understanding the professionalism that takes place within the Russian army.
In the early 1920s, the fledgling communist government decided its priorities for the years ahead, but it had many questions to answer.
When the Russians then start thinking about what shape a future war might take and what assets they might need to wage war, armour is something that they think about, because the huge expanse of Russia means that if you have something that can move fast, can move across country, and can deal death and destruction out at very long distances from your base, this is obviously something that you want in that sort of country.
But to predict the nature of future warfare meant studying how the West had waged war in the past. So Russian generals analysed World War I and used their findings to formulate a plan to beat a capitalist coalition. They called their plan Deep Battle.
The traditional Russian offensive was to advance on a mass front using mass infantry tactics. And the idea of the deep battle was, in a sense, to try and marry the whole concept of mechanised warfare using armour, lorried infantry, mobile artillery, and it's still advancing on a large front, advancing perhaps up to 100 kilometres in terms of the actual width of the advance, perhaps up to a depth of 50 kilometres, maybe even more. So a kind of, almost if you like, marrying of those two concepts, this idea of the sort of mass infantry assault over a broad front, but combining that now with mechanisation.
Now, this really is the Russian equivalent of blitzkrieg. It's all about combined arms operating together to produce shock on the battlefield deep inside enemy-held territory.
The only problem with the concept of deep battle was that it required fast and heavy tanks in vast quantities. Russia's industrial base was not nearly large enough to produce the volume of weapons and vehicles to make deep battle a reality. That, however, was about to change. In 1927, the communist leader Stalin launched a ruthless, breakneck program of industrialization and economic modernization called the 5-Year Plan. It proved remarkably successful in establishing heavy industry in just a few years, despite the enormous human cost of meeting Stalin's deadlines. In 1931, a massive tank building program was launched. Russia was finally on its way to catching up with the industrial West. By the early 1930s, Russia had undergone a radical transformation. Determined to shake off its image as a rural backwater, in the late 1920s, Stalin had launched a ruthless program of industrialization to bring it on a par with the West. By 1931, enough factories were in place to start tank production.
When the Russians begin thinking about how they can actually put a mechanized army into effect, they think of different kinds of tanks, tanks that can cooperate closely with the infantry, tanks that can operate in the kind of general area of the front line, and tanks that can exploit, which can go deep into the rear of the enemy's forces. The British have a similar concept with the idea of infantry tanks and cruiser tanks, and the infantry tanks attack the front line, the cruiser tanks exploit. The Russians do that as well, and they develop a kind of family of tanks. There are 4 of them in the course of the 1930s. They have a tankette, which is a British design. They buy a Vickers design off the shelf. They have a light tank, which is the T-26, which is another Vickers design brought off the shelf. And that's the tank which cooperates with the infantry. But to exploit the breakthrough, they develop this cruiser tank, and that tank is the BT.
The BT started life in 1930 when Russia bought 2 Christie tanks from the United States.
The BT was a clever bit of Russian stealing Western technology. It was a private venture developed in America by the Christie Corporation. It was really more of an armoured car than a tank, but it was armoured, it did have tracks, and it did have machine guns on it. Now, it didn't do terribly well in American trials, and indeed the Americans really never accepted the Christie suspension, although other countries did. But the Russians were interested in it, and the Russians bought 2 and had them shipped out to Russia. Now, because the Americans did not recognise the USSR, this had to be done clandestinely, and in fact they were brought out ostensibly as tractors. And then developed in Russia.
In many respects, the BT tank finally gave the Russians what they'd been looking for, or at least what certain factions within the Russian armoured forces had been looking for. It was the perfect weapon for the kind of deep manoeuvre. It was fast, it was very, very mobile. It could strike deep very, very, very quickly, and it could strike hard. This was a superb weapon for the Russians, and they recognised it as such when they saw Christie's design. And they took Christie's design, and instead of overly elaborating it as the British did, they kept true to its fundamental principles. The BT series itself was very little different from the Christie design. It deviated in only a small respect and was gradually and incrementally up-armoured and up-armed, and really became the design foundation for all subsequent Soviet tanks in most respects.
Designers at the Kharkov locomotive plant worked on the Christie design and came up with the BT-7 tank. It was one of the seminal designs of the 1930s. The BT-7 was the forerunner to the T-34. It had a 3-man crew. It mounted a 45mm gun and 2 7.62mm machine guns. Its armour was up to 22mm thick. It was powered by a V12 aero engine that was capable of 500 brake horsepower, a range of 430 kilometres, and a top road speed of 73 kilometres per hour. By 1937, Russia had undergone a huge transformation. Its enormous factories were outproducing those of the West. The Red Army had the largest armoured force in the world. It was equipped with the best tank of its generation and had a sophisticated doctrine of manoeuvre warfare. Stalin had made his point.
I think it's the idea of competition with the West and gigantomania is very important. The idea that we have the biggest and the fastest and the most powerful kind of equipment is very important to the Russian state, not only in terms of military equipment, but for all other kinds of manufactured goods as well. In a way, one of the reasons why tanks work better than aircraft is you can build very heavy tanks. Heavy aircraft are kind of a not particularly good idea, whereas tanks can be built with very heavy armor, with very heavy guns, and they can make the kind of point which the government wants to make. So, yes, I think it's important that the Russians do make tanks with larger guns than anybody else, tanks with heavier armor than anybody else, tanks that weigh more than anyone else's tanks, because it's part of this sense of proving that Russia has socialized and is now catching up with and overtaking the developed economies of the West.
But this massive advantage was turned upside down when Stalin suspected that key figures within the army were planning a coup. Unable to tolerate even a hint of dissent, his response was swift and brutal. In what later became known as the Purges, Stalin ordered that anyone suspected of disloyalty be killed or disappeared.
3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union are made to disappear. And of the corps commanders, these are lieutenant generals and generals, 75 out of 85 of those senior officers are eliminated in really effectively 12 to 18 months. At a divisional level, over half of the divisional commanders are also essentially killed or, in some cases, placed in gulags.
By taking out so many commanders at all levels, the standards of training, the professional standards of the Russian army inevitably declined, and the willingness of Russian commanders at all levels to use their initiative virtually stopped. Everybody was frightened of doing anything that might upset the party.
The Purges coincided with Soviet participation in the Spanish Civil War, when Stalin sent a number of T-26 and BT tanks to help the Republicans. The experience of operating tanks in Spain convinced Soviet commanders that they were too thinly armoured. But the armour wasn't their only concern. Much of their work revolved around the BT's use of tracks and wheels.
It had an interesting concept in that they had tracks and wheels. Now this sounds odd now, but at that stage, when the track technology had not been fully developed, it did make sense to approach the battle on a road on your wheels, and then in a space of about 30 minutes you could transfer it onto tracks.
The wheel-track debate abruptly ended in the winter of 1939 when the Soviet Union invaded Finland. In the face of fierce Finnish resistance, it became clear that the current generation of tanks was not sufficiently armoured or armed. But designers were sure that the tracked version of the BT could be up-armoured and up-gunned without any drop in performance. This new improved version of the BT was called T-34, to commemorate the 1934 state decree ordering a massive expansion in Soviet tank forces. 2 prototypes were ready by January 1940. Mass production began in June, and the first T-34 model emerged in September 1940. The T-34 was one of the most outstanding tanks of the Second World War. It was manned by a crew of 5. It mounted a 76.2mm gun with 2 7.62mm machine guns. Its V2 diesel engine was capable of 493 brake horsepower, a range of 300 kilometers, and a top road speed of 50 kilometers per hour.
Certainly at the time there was nothing like it anywhere in the world to compare with the Russian T-34. It was just, everybody was astonished how they could turn something out. It was just perfect. If you build a tank, you always have to compromise. the weight, the speed, the armor, one thing interferes with the other. So the whole thing has to be a compromise between all those factors.
The T-34 made its battlefield debut in June 1941, when Hitler tore up his non-aggression pact with Stalin and brought the war to Russia. In what was codenamed Operation Barbarossa, a German army of 3 million men crossed the Soviet border. The army divided into 3 groups: Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South. Army Group North was detailed to take Leningrad. Army Group Center was ordered to march on Moscow. And the task of Army Group South was to conquer the Ukraine. On paper, Russia's armoured resources looked formidable, with 21,000 tanks, compared to the Germans' mere 3,300. But nothing could have prepared the German army for the T-34. After a string of victories in Europe, German soldiers were used to crushing opposition tanks easily. The T-34's effect was utterly devastating. Otto Benze was an infantryman with Army Group North.
Haben wir erlebt. Bei Barbarossa hier, da wurden allerdings viele russische Panzer wurden tatsächlich von unserer PAK, das ist die Panzerabwehrkanonen, hatten wir da bei uns in den Stellungen mit, bei der Infanterie. Die hatten 7,5 cm, waren das Geschütze, Langrohr, und die haben die Panzer knacken können. Sonst konnte man den Panzer konnte man ja nichts machen gegen Panzer. Die waren ja so gesichert, also so fabriziert. Das war der russische T-34, das war der beste Panzer, den der Russe hatte.
The German infantry found, to its horror, that the T-34 was virtually shell-proof. The reason for this was simple, but incredibly effective: sloping armour.
One of the major strengths of the T-34 is sloping armour, something which every nation has copied. Now, the point about sloping armour is you get increased protection for the same weight. It's a simple concept, but it was the Russians who thought of it first.
It had thick armour, and it had a decent gun in the 76mm. And when the Germans met this for the first time, it outclassed everything they had. The 37mm could make no impression on it, as could the new 50mm had enough problems. It was only an in-placed 88 that could deal with it. And against a weapon like the 76mm, the 88mm gun was, in actual fact, quite vulnerable in itself. It was a large tower engaged at similar ranges, if you consider the type of countryside that some of the engagements would have taken place in. So it was a pretty attritional match between the T-34s and the 88s. So it was an enormous shock to the Germans, and they needed to do something about it very, very quickly.
Armed with Panzer IIIs and IVs, horrified German tank crews found they were simply unable to pierce the T-34's sloping armour.
Oder noch schwächer, vielleicht mal eine 7,5 dabei. Sie nannten diese Geschütze Panzeranklopfgeräte, weil wir waren panzermäßig den Russen unterlegen. Die hatten mit ihrem legendären T-34 eine ganz andere Panzerwaffe.
Yet the Soviets faced some serious problems at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. They had the excellent T-34, but there were too few of them, and they were not concentrated in battle. The odd T-34 did pose some tactical problems for Hitler's army, but superior German training and doctrine almost outweighed this advantage. In 1941, the Soviets paid a heavy price for Stalin's purges. Those soldiers left in the Red Army had no battlefield experience and lacked adequate training. It became standard practice for men to go into battle after just 1 hour in a tank.
you need at least 6 years training to do your job properly. But Stalin, he done away with hundreds and hundreds of high-ranking officers. I believe most of the generals, the army commanders, the lot. The so-called purges of Stalin in Russia at the time took the lives of about 35,000 officers and generals. All shot without any sort of court case out of hand. And of course this disrupted the whole Russian build-up of their own forces, which after all were only then starting after the Civil War. And Russia found itself in a very difficult situation.
Firstly, there is a lack of crew training. Crews have been rushed in from the infantry and from the cavalry with minimal training. Junior officers have also not had sufficient training or courses, and therefore at that level the crews are really learning on the job. There's also in the early T-34 design a very sort of poor vision arrangement, in the sense that tank crews find it very difficult to see properly, and that's going to affect the operational effectiveness of this vehicle, particularly in the turret.
Communication in the Red Army was appalling. Many soldiers were illiterate, and there was a chronic shortage of radios, making command and control nearly impossible.
Every German tank had a radio. Every American tank had a radio. In 1941, command tanks in the Red Army had radios, and the rest didn't. And the way in which a troop commander told the other tanks what to do was to wave signal flags at them, which is not a very good idea in the middle of a tank battle, or simply follow me. The other tanks followed the lead tank. So the idea of sophisticated tactics was very difficult if communications weren't very good.
By October, Army Group Center was just 25 kilometers from Moscow. But as the weather deteriorated, the German tanks' tracks became clogged with mud and later struggled in the snow. The T-34, with its Christie suspension, wide tracks and low ground pressure, remained mobile. Again, Soviet designers used simple designs to great effect.
They had one terribly simple little idea. One of the problems you always have with tanks is the track pins. Now, the track pin is literally a steel pin that holds the different sectors of track together. And one of the problems is that they sometimes come out. And it's quite difficult in an engineering sense to make the thing stay in. What the Russians did was they put a curved plate on the inside of the track, so that any track pin that was halfway out, as the track came round, the curved plate just pushed it back into position again.
As the winter started to slow the German army, Russian troops enjoyed the advantages of a tank built to withstand the harsh weather. Its V2 engine ran on diesel that froze at a lower temperature than the petrol used by the Germans. There was no need to light fires under the T-34 to get its engine to start.
The temperatures dropped to minus 56 degrees. The Germans, not prepared for any sort of winter war, were caught absolutely unawares. Their weapons wouldn't work anymore because they didn't have any anti-frost liquid. They didn't have any anti-frost grease to keep the guns going. Everything just got stuck under the enormous ice cover and snow cover you got in Russia before Moscow.
The T-34 was well adapted for winter conditions, particularly the tracks. It had very broad tracks compared with other vehicles of the period. The Germans, in order to cope with the snow, had to fit enlarged track shoes on the outside of the tracks, which were not a terribly effective way. They broke off quite easily. The T-34, as it was, could run quite easily on snow. The Christie suspension didn't pack with snow and ice as easily as the German multi-wheel, multi-bogie and levered suspensions did, which were quite vulnerable to this. Also, the engine ran extremely well in the cold. It was a very, very good engine from that point of view. And the Germans simply had far more trouble maintaining their tanks in that kind of performance. Obviously, the T-34 had been designed for the terrain in which it operated. It had been designed to operate in Russia. It had been built with Russian experience in mind. The basic norms of everyday conditions in Russia were at the back of everything that they did. The Germans, likewise, the norms of everyday conditions and infrastructure in Germany determined the way the Germans built their tanks, and really, you know, the Eastern Front was not Germany.
Although the harsh winter was slowing the German advance, time was rapidly running out for the Soviets. It started to look like there would be no quick German victory, but a long, drawn-out battle of attrition, where sheer numbers would account for as much as tactical genius. After suffering catastrophic losses in 1941, pressure was on the Red Army to retrain and re-equip by the spring of 1942. The only way the Soviet Union was going to beat the Axis would be with the help of many, many more T-34s. But there was a problem. Most of Russia's heavy industry was in the path of the German onslaught. Leningrad was a center for heavy tank production and had already become encircled by the German army. So, in late 1941, Stalin thought the unthinkable and took the unprecedented step of relocating the Soviet armaments industry eastwards to the Urals, Volga, eastern Siberia, and Central Asia. Factories were reassembled in appalling conditions, similar to those endured under the 5-year plan. But the sheer scale of the relocation was something not seen before.
This movement of industrial plant in particular was at least partially successful. It wasn't wholly successful, but it is a matter of historical record that something like 2,500 factories were moved from somewhere like, in terms of a geographical equivalent, the south of England, and rebuilt as somewhere as far away as Iceland, and that was achieved with really minimal disruption to industrial production. In terms of tank production and artillery production, we see ongoing increases, steady increases in Soviet production figures during 1942, 43 and 44.
As the T-34 outclassed German tanks by such a huge margin, the Soviets did not have to spend time developing new models. And while the Germans struggled to develop a match for the T-34, the Soviets could concentrate on production. That is, until German designers finally did come up with an answer. German High Command did not expect a long, drawn-out struggle when it ordered the invasion of Russia in 1941. It did not think the Russians capable of producing a battle-worthy tank, and a string of victories in Europe merely strengthened Hitler's belief in the Third Reich's invincibility. When Barbarossa started, there was no intention to replace the Panzer IV, the workhorse of the German tank arm. However, the T-34 had shattered the myth of Soviet inferiority, and the Germans desperately needed a new tank that could match, if not beat, the T-34. Although it wasn't politically acceptable to be seen to copy the T-34, that is in fact what the Germans did. Their answer was the Panzer Mark V, named the Panther, which owed much to the T-34. Its excellent 75mm gun and thick sloped armour made the new tank a particularly dangerous adversary. The Germans waited until the summer of 1943 before they unleashed their new weapon.
Between June of 41 and the summer of 43, the Germans make every attempt to match the Russians in terms of quality, if not of quantity. So they're trying to have tanks that are as good as the T-34 and the KV. So they build the Tiger to really have the same kind of armor as the KV, and with a gun that can penetrate the armor of either the T-34 or the KV. It's an 88mm high-velocity gun. It's ideal for knocking out other tanks. They develop another tank which is, in effect, kind of not really a clone of the T-34, but is designed to have the same kind of attributes as the T-34. It has sloped armor, it's got a heavy gun, a 75mm gun, and that's the Panther. So the Panther is, if you like, the German version of the T-34. It's much heavier. In fact, the Panther is the same size as the KV. It's really quite a big tank, but technically it's as good or better than the T-34.
After defeating the Germans at Stalingrad during the winter of 1942-43, a huge salient in the line, 160 kilometers wide and 110 kilometers deep, centered on the city of Kursk. Ignoring advice from his generals urging a temporary shift to the defensive, Hitler decided that his army should regain the initiative by crushing the Kursk salient. But a member of Hitler's entourage had tipped off the Russians, who already suspected that an attack would be launched around Kursk. So the Red Army transformed the bulge into a huge fortress, where the German army would be channeled into Soviet fields of fire by carefully placed minefields. When all the preparations were finished, 1,336,000 Russian soldiers and 3,444 tanks, most of them T-34s, sat in or behind 8 defensive belts, stretching back 175 kilometers. Although the Germans only fielded 900,000 men and 2,700 armored vehicles to do the job, they were confident their new heavy Tiger tanks and medium Panthers would cancel out the Soviet advantage in numbers. But at Kursk, the German army would be dogged by the same problems that had hampered the Red Army in 1941: lack of crew training.
Hitler wouldn't wait. He waited for his new tanks, which of course came just off the production line. Not even the crews were trained properly, and the tanks weren't tried out. As the tanks arrived for his big battle, they broke down on the way, especially the new Panzer, which only just after 50 months' work on it had taken the road. It broke down left, right, and center, you see, because it was untied. Usually the exhaust systems overheated and set the whole exhaust system fuel collected in there. Sometimes set it on fire, and the tanks burned out even, or exploded. So he lost quite a few of his 200 tanks. And then he also had the Tiger, of course. But the Tiger was a bit more reliable because it had been tried earlier. But still, it was an unknown quantity, especially to the crews. They weren't properly trained on them.
The German offensive began on the 5th of July and was met by remarkably stiff resistance. The depth of Soviet defences meant that the Germans failed to make the inroads that they'd expected. But at Kursk, the Red Army discovered that the T-34 no longer had the edge in tank-to-tank combat.
It's curious that there are really better tanks on the German side at Kursk, but because the Russians have the numbers and because they also have a better system, now they can operate tanks in large groups, they can communicate, they have skilled commanders, they have skilled division and corps leaders. They can actually win a major battle in the summertime against the Wehrmacht. That's why the battle is important, because at Moscow in 1941, at Stalingrad in 1942, the battle is really fought in the winter. It's a kind of infantry battle. It isn't really it isn't about tank warfare, but Kursk is. And in 1943, the Russians in effect win that battle because at the Battle of Kursk and the Battle of Oryol right afterwards, they drive the Germans back. So they fight. They actually can fight an effective tank battle under modern conditions, and that's the coming of age of the Red Army.
The main problem lay in the inability of the T-34's 76.2mm gun to penetrate the frontal armour of the Panther and Tiger at anything but dangerously close range. Essentially, the T-34 needed a bigger gun. So in August 1943, work began on making the necessary improvements to keep the T-34 a viable combat vehicle. After the changes were made, the new tank entered production in January 1944. The tank that emerged was called the T-34-85. It had a 5-man crew. It got its name from its larger 85mm gun. It also mounted two 7.62mm machine guns. With armour up to 90mm thick, it was powered by the trusted V2 engine that was capable of 500 brake horsepower and a range of 300 kilometres. It could hit a top road speed of 50 kilometres per hour.
The T-34-85 is essentially the T-34 with all its faults ironed out. It's got a turret that is much better than the previous one. 3 men can now work perfectly comfortably in the turret. It's got rid of things like the shell trap. It's got a better gun, and it's up-armoured. Despite that, it's still almost as fast as the T-34. When it comes out, it's the most powerful Allied tank anywhere, and indeed came as a bit of a shock to the Allies in 1945.
The new 85mm gun was effective up to at least 1,000 metres and could penetrate the frontal armour of the Tiger and Panther. One of the advantages of the T-34-85 was that it didn't involve a long and complicated design process that had dictated production of the German Panther. Another bonus was that it could be produced using the same production line as the T-34-76. It was soon being produced in as vast a quantity as its predecessor. In 1944, 11,000 T-34-85s were built, 2.5 times that of its German rival, the Panther. The T-34-85 entered service with the 1st Guards Tank Army and was welcomed by crews as a tank that could hold its own amongst the Tigers and Panthers. When offensive operations restarted in 1944, the improved Soviet operational skill, the better trained generation of tankmen, and powerful new vehicles inflicted a series of telling blows on the Germans. Under Operation Bagration in June 1944, Soviet infantry and heavy tanks battered a path through German lines which was exploited by the more nimble and reliable T-34. By late July, Soviet tanks had reached the Vistula and the gates of Warsaw. Bagration showed how far the Red Army had come in terms of leadership, combatability, and equipment. It was one of the most sustained and sophisticated operations of the war. The efforts of the summer stretched the Soviet logistical chain to the limit, and large-scale operations were not resumed until January 1945. But by the 16th of April 1945, the Red Army had reached the outskirts of Berlin. A mixture of German regular troops, old men, and Hitler youth fought for every street, house, and room. The close range of combat and limited room for maneuver made the T-34s and other Soviet armoured vehicles extremely vulnerable to the defenders armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, mines, and Molotov cocktails. More than 800 Soviet tanks were lost in the bitter fighting. But despite fanatical German resistance, the Red Army captured the Reichstag on the 30th of April. Hitler shot himself that same day. The city surrendered on the 2nd of May, and all German forces finally surrendered on the 7th. The Soviets managed to strike a perfect balance between the need for firepower, mobility, and protection in the T-34. It was a technological hybrid of the world's most cutting-edge designs. For Stalin, it was the symbol of Mother Russia's iron will to overwhelm the capitalist West, both industrially and militarily. Yet, curiously, it retained a feature that symbolizes capitalism itself.
One rather amusing aspect of the T-34's performance, which is perhaps visible in the vehicle behind, which certainly appealed to the German sense of humour, was the fact that the hatches on the T-34, when opened on the 85, looked like Mickey Mouse's ears, which was quite ironic given the iconic status of Mickey Mouse within the capitalist world and the iconic status of the T-34 in the communist world. Quite an amusing contrast.
Stalin knew that the only way to beat the Third Reich was to keep producing the T-34 in vast numbers. He also knew that in order to keep Russia's factories ticking over, tanks had to be simply designed. And it was the T-34's simplicity that drove the Nazi army out of Russia. Its design remained virtually unchanged throughout the war. It could outgun most German tanks. It was fast, well protected, and easy to maintain. German designers copied the T-34, but their attempts failed catastrophically. The product of a proud industrial colossus, the T-34 was instrumental in crushing the German army and has rightly earned its place as one of the greatest tanks of the 20th century.
The T-34 is not the best tank of the war in terms of engineering, in terms of performance, but it's the best all-round tank of the war. It's deliberately designed to be able to be mass-produced in huge quantities. The Russians turned out something like 55,000 T-34s and their variants during the war. It was easy to operate. It could be operated by essentially a peasant army. It had parts that were interchangeable with all sorts of other tanks. If you needed a spare engine, you could get it from a KV. If you needed various other bits and pieces, you could take it from other vehicles. The T-34 wasn't the best tank of the war, but in terms of what it did, in terms of what it achieved, it was the most effective tank of the war.